We're all familiar with the cartoon characters, sitting on clouds, playing their harps in often this otherworldly kind of ethereal, atmospheric, fuzzy thing that we think of as heaven. That is not how the Bible describes our ultimate destiny. Our ultimate destiny is a new heavens and a new earth, a cosmic renewal. Not a spiritual as opposed to a material realm, but a renewed material realm. So it's very physical. It's very material. When Jesus rose from the dead, he retained his body. Still had his body, his physicality. He said over and over again, see, touch, put your fingers in my side. I'm not, a ghost has no flesh and bones, as you see. So the material world is destined for transformation and renewal and glorification.
Well, welcome. Today we are with theologian, writer, and musician Brian Mattson. Brian was born and raised in the state of Montana, where he currently lives. He studied theology at Westminster Theological Seminary, and he did his PhD in systematic theology at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. And he currently serves as the Senior Scholar of Public Theology for the Center for Cultural Leadership. Brian, thanks for joining Karen and I today.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Yes, I've been looking forward to this. Back in 2024, we had a number of scholars come with some faith and work practitioners and talk about essays that each one of you had written. And today we want to talk about your essay. And I want to start where you started, which was the story of your daughter asking whether there would be Chinese food in heaven or not. And so I'm wondering, can you share that moment with us and why you think that such a childlike question actually opens up really profound and good theological discussion?
Yeah, it was really quite a quaint and poignant, daddy-daughter moment. So my wife and my two older girls were away on a trip. And so my 9-year-old, I was, kind of Mr. Momming it for a week or so. So of course you find easy things to cook, like pre-prepared Chinese cuisine. It's probably not even Chinese cuisine, but Asian food that you throw in the oven and pull it out. And my daughter just loves it. So we were sitting and we were eating dinner, and she was really enjoying her meal. And then she just popped the question to me, Dad, will there be Chinese food in heaven? And of course, I flippantly answered the question like, yes, yeah, of course, we're going to have Chinese food in heaven. And almost as I was saying the words, and I don't know why, it's possible that I had been thinking about and reading and doing some theological study where I was, subconsciously making connections. But almost as I was saying it, I had an epiphany that is such a deeply profound question that actually raises deep theological questions, doctrinal questions that have been wrestled with all the way through church history for the last 2,000 years. That's a question. Will there be Chinese food in heaven? That's a question involving metaphysics, the nature of things. It's a question about universals and particulars. This is not just food. Will there be food in heaven? Will there be Chinese food in heaven? Now we're talking about ethnicity, a subset of humanity. So universals and particulars, we're talking about telos, or end or purposes of things. Things in this world, a cultural artifact like Chinese food, will that carry into the hereafter? Is that going to be in heaven? So in the paper, I rephrased to try to draw out the significance of that question. I rephrased it and I wrote, Dad, is this human cultural artifact known as Chinese food, crafted with human ingenuity from the raw materials of God's original creation, going to survive the eschatological cataclysm of the last day, and exist and be enjoyed in the new heavens and the new earth. This is a systematic theology question, something that simple. So I had this epiphany as she asked the question, and as it so happened, I had recently had an invite from you all to participate in this symposium on faith and work. And so that was a very, very happy providential coincidence. So that sort of became my launching pad into my paper. And so my goal was to answer that question with a lot more theological foundation than just my fatherly say so. Yes, child, there will be Chinese food in heaven. So that was it. That was the aim of it.
So, Brian, you frame up the scope of your paper as to a from the perspective of neo-Calvinism. So, for our listeners, can you help us talk about the term neo-Calvinism? In particular, on page 13 of your essay, you talk about it as that it was a cultural force that was notwithstanding a variety of controversies about common grace and diverse emphases or excess in various geographical quarters. Can you talk a little bit about the origins of the term neo-Calvinism?
Yeah, sure. Neo-Calvinism was really a movement in Holland, in the Netherlands, in the 19th century, spearheaded by a name people probably will recognize, Abraham Kuyper, who was a polymath, theologian, journalist, writer, speaker, politician, and he had a little movement that became known as neo-Calvinism. And initially, that was a pejorative term. People were kind of accusing Kuyper and his group of sort of perverting Calvinism. It's a neo-Calvinism. It's not kind of classical Reformed Calvinism. But neo-Calvinism became kind of its own movement, and it has particularities. It has unique emphases. One of which is the rejection or resistance to a kind of nature-grace dualism. This idea that there's naturally an antagonism between the spiritual life and the material world. You think of it in terms of spirit and matter dualism. Like the really important stuff is the internal, the invisible, the spiritual, whereas the external physical world is somehow less important. And so there's this division or dichotomy, and people sense that anytime. And in fact, Herman Bavinck was Abraham Kuyper's right-hand man, and really Bavinck was the theologian of neo-Calvinism. And he once said that everybody feels this tension when they just consider the relationship between their heavenly calling and their earthly vocation. Like it doesn't feel like those things are meshing, right? There's a conflict. Neo-Calvinism is very keen to say that tension that we feel is a tension that's caused by sin, by dysfunction, by disorder that has entered into God's good creation. So neo-Calvinism is a very creation-affirming theology, that God made a very good creation, and many various streams of Christianity throughout history have had a suspicion of creation itself. Touch not, taste not, don't handle, sort of an asceticism that withdraws itself from the world, from the rich world of civilization and culture. There's this non-participation in creational goods. And so neo-Calvinism is really a reaction to that. And saying, no, God's creation is very good. It's the problem is not the stuff, problem is sin. Sin can be separated from the stuff. And of course, that's what's going to happen on the last day, is that judgment fire is going to purify this very good creation that God created. So that was where neo-Calvinism came from. It was Kuyper and it was Bavinck. It was exported, of course, into North America, particularly by the Dutch Reformed in Michigan and also in Toronto. And so it was a compelling worldview. And I think it remains compelling ultimately because it does have very strong biblical foundation.
So good. So good. So I think following on with that, how would neo-Calvinism name that impulse that many Christians throughout history have experienced, where they find themselves viewing the world in this dualism, the matter-spirit dualism? How does neo-Calvinism name that impulse?
Well, typically it will be described as a nature-grace dualism. This is really what Bavinck is concerned about throughout his entire theological work, is fighting this nature-grace dualism. That's not to say there's not a nature-grace duality. There's a difference between a duality and a dualism. There is such a thing as an internal spiritual life and an external material existence. It's seeing that as an antagonism, as though those two things inherently can't be woven together and meshed. But typically, they will talk about world flight. And I think people generally have a sense of what that is, a kind of Christian fundamentalism that shies away from the world, not just sin, not just sinful behaviors and sinful activities, but human activities, things that is natural and good for people to be involved in. There's a suspicion of that. And neo-Calvinism wants people to engage the world, not flee from the world, but to engage culture.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And of course, one of the ways and places that humans engage culture proportionally the most is in the work of our hands. It's all that we do that we call work, whether we're paid for that work or we're not paid for that work. And so to live with this world flight mentality has us living either in compartments or in conflict in one sense. Trying to live a coherent life is challenging if we have this nature-grace dualism. And so many people experience that, maybe even people who are listening to this podcast right now. And one of the things that you said at the top was helpful in terms of context, that the invitation, all of these papers were written from the perspective or in the context of work and vocation and culture. And so many people hearing this right now may have heard that their work matters to God in some way. But as you said, the particularity is really what you found most interesting in this exploration, in this essay. So if we think about work in general, a lot of people, their discipleship or thought remains at that general level, which is my work matters to God. But when you start getting into the particulars, that's when it gets more fuzzy. And so, for example, you argue that things that we make, actually, maybe not every single example, but there are examples of things that we make, like art and music and meals and maybe even machines, or at some level, all work has a place in God's future. So for someone new to this idea, why is this maybe such a radical idea for some, but also a really hopeful claim that the Bible offers us?
Yeah, so it's radical because it is so counter to the popular imagination about what our ultimate destiny is, right? I mean, we're all familiar with the cartoon characters, sitting on clouds, playing their harps in often this otherworldly kind of ethereal, atmospheric, fuzzy thing that we think of as heaven. That is not how the Bible describes our ultimate destiny. Our ultimate destiny is a new heavens and a new earth, a cosmic renewal, not a spiritual as opposed to a material realm, but a renewed material realm. So it's very physical. It's very material. When Jesus rose from the dead, he retained his body. Still had his body, his physicality. He said over and over again, see, touch. Put your fingers in my side. I'm not, a ghost has no flesh and bones, as you see. So the material world is destined for transformation and renewal and glorification. So it's radically different than the sort of spiritualized notion of heaven that's so often understood. How is it helpful or hopeful? Well, it seems to me that we live in a time and a place where our culture is experiencing a crisis of meaning. What is it all for? What is it all about? There's a crisis of meaning. And that extends, of course, to our vocations, to our work, the labors of our hands. Why are we engaged in this? Many Christians, I think that we're just muddling through, trying to survive so that we can finally check out of here and go off to bliss in the hereafter. And what I'm really trying to challenge people to see is that what you do and how you're living right now and what you're doing matters. It has meaning. It has purpose. God has plans for this. Ephesians chapter 2, everybody's familiar with the wonderful affirmation in Ephesians 2 that it is by grace we are saved, not of works, by faith. It goes on to say that we are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to do good works that he has prepared for us beforehand. Like our salvation extends to our work, our vocations. And I think that groups like the Faith and Work project that you're involved in has done a wonderful job recovering this Christian doctrine of vocation, that our callings matter. But I wonder sometimes if we think that through and extend it as far as it needs to go. And probably one of the more provocative suggestions that I'm making in this paper is to question the categorical denial that you see in some Christian circles, the categorical denial that cultural artifacts, human work product, will enter into the new heavens and the new earth. There are people who emphatically reject that nothing from this age makes it into the age to come. I'm pushing back against that and questioning that. I wonder if it's really possible to separate our work as a general idea or category from work product. What are we actually producing in our work? I wonder why would it be wrong to encourage the Christian artist to paint a painting like they have the thought in their head that this painting is going to adorn the walls of a palace in eternity. In an eternal care paravel, my painting is going to hang in a drawing room, in some palace in heaven. Why is it wrong to encourage a musician to write a song that will reverberate throughout eternity, to write something worthy of the King?
If so much of our human work and material creation is intended to address our own mortality and our own sustenance on the earth, and if so much of our work and our creation is offsetting sin, so like if we look at the fact that your daughter's Chinese food was giving her the necessary sustenance for life, and if we look at your example of, an auto repair mechanic, they're enabling transportation to function. If those things are offsetting, and there's definitely parts of creation for our pleasure, but so much of it, the things that are pleasurable, like the Bach sonata, is intended to point us to God in the time that we are not in the new creation. And so much of things we delight in is meant to soothe us and heal us while we are in this age. What is the purpose? God doesn't need us to populate the new creation. So what might be, philosophically speaking, of what we know about the attributes of God and the description of the new creation? Why? Why might God need us? Why might there be creation in the new age? Our creation.
Just to make sure I'm clear on your question, you're making an excellent point, by the way, about so much of our work being to alleviate the fall and sin and its effects. So my thesis runs into a little bit of difficulty, and I fully admit it, when you start asking, well, what is a medical doctor going to do in the new heavens and the new earth, right? If there's no illness, there's no sickness, there's no death, like how does a doctor's work reverberate into eternity? So that's one part of that question. So I acknowledge, yeah, there are law enforcement, right? Are you going to have law enforcement in the new heavens and the new earth? No, certainly not, right? There's no law breaking that
Thermometers.
happens.
Like, we're not going to need thermometers in the new heaven and the new earth, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, those are very interesting questions that quickly get us into speculation. One of the interesting things about the Bible is actually how little it tells us about what eternity is going to be like. It gives us these absolutely grand visual images, but doesn't give us details at all. I think it's to provoke our imaginations, but we can easily get into that kind of speculation.
You use
but
the
your
language,
question,
you call it the limits, the outer limits of our epistemic capabilities.
right? We have outer limits of our epistemic capabilities. There's a point at which we just do not know. The Lord has not seen fit to give us this information. Now, there's a second part to your question. And that second part, as I recall, is why would God need us to create in the new heavens and the new earth? I want to answer that question by asking the question: why did He create us in the first place as creative cultivators of His creation? In the Garden of Eden, He did not give the mandate to Adam and Eve to cultivate and take dominion over nature to alleviate sin. There was no sin. So there's a pre-fall mandate that human beings are going to be divine image bearers. That is, they're going to be like God. Now, God just spent 6 days creating ex nihilo, out of nothing, and now He creates these little God replicas, Adam and Eve, and He says, you too are going to be creative. You're going to cultivate. You're going to take dominion. So this is a pre-fall mandate that this is God's purpose for what human beings are supposed to do. We're supposed to take God's creation and make something with it, make something beautiful, and all ultimately for His glory, right? We're God reflectors. We're His image bearers. So that kind of work, although, again, you can get into speculation, we're going to be doing something, I believe, because that's what God made human beings to do. Why would He need it in eternity? Well, the same reason He wanted it at the beginning, and that is to proclaim the glory of His name. This is all for the glorification of God and for our blessedness and our happiness as we adorn and beautify and make things with His creation. So that's a great question, but remember that this mandate was given when there was no sin. That this is intrinsic to what it means to be human, is to work.
And if you subscribe to the covenant of redemption, then you would imagine that the anticipation of the fall and the work of Christ was foreknown at that time.
Yes. I agree with that. The end has to match the beginning, and this is something that I think is really important for people to get. I like to put it this way often: that Genesis 1 is the once upon a time. Revelation 22 is the happily ever after. So that's the story of redemption. There's a once upon a time, and then there's a happily ever after. And as everyone knows, a good story, a good fairy tale, a good narrative, the once upon a time and the happily ever after have to fit each other. The one has to flow from the other. So what I'm getting at here is that God, in his work of redemption, is not scrapping his original plan. He's not saying, oh, well, I wanted this to be the case, that my little image bearers are creative and take dominion and all that. That didn't work out. Let me scrap that plan and let's go to something else. That's not what the happily ever after is. The happily ever after is that the second Adam, the Lord Jesus Christ, the eternal Son of God, took Adam's place and has brought Adam's mandate to fulfillment. And he's now invited us into this new humanity that's going to fulfill God's original purpose for why he created us, for fellowship with him, with one another, and to be the lords of creation. And we're going to have a new creation to do that. Once upon a time and happily ever after have to mesh with each other. And they do in that narrative.
So as a musician, you get to speak with your daughters about imagining that you will be hearing the music you create together in eternity.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe. If
Maybe.
it's good enough, I don't know.
Maybe. If it meets the test is mysterious.
The test is mysterious. I don't know. Or we will be writing new kinds of music, you know?
It'll be better.
In the hereafter. It'll be better. That's right. That's right.
One of the things that I really enjoy about this conversation in this paper is that even though at the beginning we started a really poignant conversation that anyone who has children or has been around young children can imagine asking, but it's not just young children. We all in our own way ask this question. Sometimes it's posed as a philosophical question. Sometimes it's posed as just a reflection on what it all means. How do I find meaning in my work? Will this last? What's this all for? And we have to answer those questions from some type of biblical and theological framework if we want to be consistent, but also if we want to be faithful to the scriptures. And one of the things that I love so much about the way you're answering this question is you're very, very committed and clear about, hey, here is my theological persuasion. This is how I understand fundamentally the relationship between nature and grace, between creation and redemption. And so the end has to match the beginning. And so all of these things, we have Bavinck lectures at our Institute for Faith, Work, and Culture here. So we lean heavily into our Reformed tradition and the Dutch neo-Calvinist tradition. And all the things you're talking about right now, remind me of a section in your paper where you're exploring, you're pushing the outer boundaries, as you say, but you're working consistently from a theological framework. And you say our work product is ontological. They're ontological substances crafted and cultivated by divine image bearers, right? Because we have agency in our creation and in our sanctification. God continues to give us agency and a role as image bearers. And then you say everything in neo-Calvinism presses in the direction of an affirmative answer to our question, which I agree. In many ways, it does press toward that. So I wonder, with that as a backdrop, I can imagine people who may be tracking and say, yeah, I would subscribe to a neo-Calvinist framework as well, but I refuse to take it that far, or however they might protest or balk at the exercise that you're engaging in here. So how might you both affirm that and maybe challenge it? That position of, hey, I'm with you, I'm tracking, but I don't think we can go this far. How would you affirm that? And then how might you respond and challenge?
I think it might depend a little bit on the reason somebody doesn't want to go there, because that resistance has a reason. There's a cause to that resistance, and so I would probe a little bit and try to ask somebody what makes them uncomfortable about that. There are of course, neo-Calvinism is not the only theological framework. It's not the only theological tradition. So there will be people with alternate perspectives and alternate frameworks who would object to this. And so, I suppose we could get into that. There are people who see the Bible's description of the last judgment and the day of judgment. They will find biblical passages that talk about the burning of everything, the dissolving of creation, the fire, the purifying fire, melting everything. And they see this cataclysmic day of judgment, and they say, look, it's all getting burned up. Nothing is going to survive this. It's all getting burned. I understand and I sympathize with that perspective, that reaction, and I have answers for what I think is going on in those texts. So there are people who have a cataclysmic view of the end, where continuity between this age and the age to come, they have trouble wrapping their head around that. So that could be one reason somebody's resistant to that. Another reason is that a lot of people really do embrace a kind of spirit-matter dualism, where the material world is just of lesser importance, of lesser value, and God never intended it to go on forever. And so they really do kind of conceive of the age to come as a very non-physical, spiritual kind of existence, and where really the material is sort of left behind. I mean, that point of view, if pressed all the way where it sort of logically goes, ends up going in directions where the ancient Gnostics took it. And that is, it's a denial of the resurrection of the body. So at death, we actually escape the material realm because it's all bad. It's getting burned up. We escape it and we go to some ethereal spiritual realm. That's sort of where that sort of dualism can lead and has led in the past. So those could be some reasons people don't want to follow me thus far. Another is that it just, again, leads to really fuzzy, tricky questions. In the paper, I'm interacting a little bit with Todd Billings. Todd wrote an article where he asked a really good question, and he was responding to something that N.T. Wright had written about Bach's music being, played in eternity. And Todd Billings asked, well, I have a friend who's dying of cancer, and he worked his whole life as an auto mechanic. He asks, why is Bach's work more valuable than my friend's work? Now that is an outstanding question. I was disappointed that Billings didn't really dive into it. He sort of took it as an obvious answer. Like, well, Bach's music isn't more important than my friend's work. And if my friend's work isn't going, why is Bach's? Like, that was just, he left the question. I actually thought that was an outstanding question. But it gets into those very particular things. Is the Ford F-150 that you just fixed the engine on, is that going to make it into eternity? Probably not. Jesus talks about moths and rust destroying, right? I mean, we do have we do have rust. We do have things breaking down all the time. It isn't really probably true that all human artifacts are going into heaven. So, and I grant that. I grant it. I don't think, however, one can make categorical statements like, it's all going to burn, nothing is coming with us. Really, when Jesus returns, all the infrastructure and architecture of creation is going to vanish and be destroyed. We won't have houses and buildings. There won't be, I mean, maybe this is true. But I am asking this question that I don't see it as outlandish to think that human work product and human artifacts may survive. And I argue this at a little bit of greater length in the paper.
That's helpful. I wonder, how would you respond to a person who might be listening to this let's say that they are a knowledge worker, just in general, maybe middle manager, and they have come in their faith journey to embrace most, or if not, all of what we're talking about. So what I mean by that is they absolutely find meaning in their work. They understand how it serves the customers, how their management helps their coworkers and those who work for them flourish. They understand business as a good thing. So they've embraced this. They're pushing toward coherence. They want to steward all of their callings, including this role. And yet they say, I don't think I need my work to make it through the process of purification, because I know that it has meaning in a way that is just mysterious, and I don't have to think about that. How would you respond to that person?
I think that it is mysterious, but I don't think, I think that's sort of a stopping short, which may be okay, but I would want to encourage somebody to think a little bit more deeply about this. And I'm glad you brought up people, knowledge workers, people who are not necessarily making things with their hands, right? Or they're not artists or sculptors or painters, but people who are involved in knowledge work. This is very important because one of the points I try to make in this paper, and this is in response, by the way, to Todd Billings's question about his auto mechanic friend and his work not making it into the hereafter. I actually try to make a case that I think that auto mechanic's work does make it into the hereafter. It may not be the physical artifact, okay? The Ford F-150 may rust and be destroyed, and we're not going to see it in the hereafter. However, the knowledge of that vehicle, the knowledge of all the intricate parts and how they work, the knowledge of how to fix that vehicle exists. And it exists as a result of work. It is a work product. The reason a mechanic knows how to fix that car is because he fixes cars, right? So there's this surplus of knowledge. Think about it as subject matter expertise, right? In a prior life, I used to be a clerk of district court. And sometimes we would have trials, and the expert witness would get called. The expert witness might be an engineer, a structural engineer or something, and he would come in, and I would swear him in to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help him God, and he would sit down. That engineer did not bring his work product with him. He didn't bring in the physical thing that he knew about. He brought himself. And he sat down on the stand and he gave subject matter expertise, all of which is a work product. Now, here's my point. Individuals and communities and humanity as a whole has built up a vast knowledge, vast reservoir of God's creation, of how it works. Think about its science, its industry, its agriculture, its art, it's human relations, it's sociology. Think about all of that knowledge. That's work product. And I want to argue that work product inherently has to come with us. Why? Because the alternative is that on the last day, when the last day comes and we're resurrected and we're in our resurrected bodies, I'm going to ask a question. Will we know ourselves? Will the mechanic receive his body back and not know how to fix an engine? Will he know how a wheel works? Will he still have his knowledge of how God's creation works and how God made it? I want to say yes. I think that that's what resurrection means, is that we are raised and we are still ourselves. We're not going to go into eternity not knowing how to start a fire. We don't have to invent fire all over again, right? I'm arguing that knowledge is itself a work product, so that mechanic can know that what I've done with my life, that what I have done is going to carry through because I'm carrying through. I think the same is true for knowledge workers. I think the same is true for middle management people. What do they do? They are custodians of human relationships and leadership and and social cooperation. Experts in it even. Those skills could very well be needed in the hereafter to organize people, leadership in projects on this and that. I think that our gifts and our skills and what we do, whether it's physically with our hands, creation of physical products, or if it's intellectual work, if it's knowledge work, if it's human relations, think about the hospitality industry, whatever it is, I think there's work product that carries on with us because we carry on into the hereafter.
Wow. Well, I have some friends in mind right now, and I'm thinking they're amening you up and down because they may be thinking, listen, my spreadsheets might not matter, but my knowledge of Excel and the beauty of what it can produce, it matters, right? I mean, I say it in jest, but it's serious. Anybody who has given themselves to learn a software that churches can use to manage volunteers and NASA can use to put things on the moon, or whatever they use it for, is a pretty complex software that they have given themselves to learn and to understand the relationship between data and so on. So I greatly appreciate that. I wonder, I'll give you the final word, Brian. What might you leave our listeners who may be on their way to work right now as they listen to this? How would you encourage them as a fellow brother who believes in the goodness of work?
I think what I would say is if you're on your way to work right now, I would encourage you to reflect on the fact that our future, our eternal life is going to be a new heavens and a new earth. That it is not a fluffy, ethereal, spiritual existence, a disembodied existence. It's actually a physical reality, a physical place where we will be with our resurrected Lord Jesus Christ, who has a resurrection body and will keep it forever. And we're going to be with him. And the Bible describes that reality as sort of a super abundant Garden of Eden. Okay. So the happily ever after connects to the once upon a time. What God made us for is to be co-creators, cultivators, lords of creation. And at the end of the Bible, it describes it as a sort of super Eden. There's a tree of life. There's a tree of life is lining the river on both sides, a super abundant Eden, but it is also a garden city. It's a garden city. A city is a place that has a lot of moving parts. A city is a place where there's a lot of work. There's a lot of service. There's a lot of productivity. And so whatever it is you are doing in your work today, think of it as you are preparing for heaven. Preparing for heaven is not just your devotional time. It's not just when you go to worship, although that is not just when you're worshiping on Sunday, but everything you do, whatever you do, Paul says, do it all for the glory of God. You are preparing for eternity. So treat your work like you're preparing for eternity.
So good. Well, Brian, thank you for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. Yeah, thanks so much.